She built her whole life on control. Then one car ruined everything. A black man moved into her perfect neighborhood. She decided he didn't belong. She searched his Lamborghini without permission. Months later, the cameras were still rolling. By the end, she wasn't the one in charge anymore. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 14 years becoming an orthopedic surgeon before I ever thought about buying a Lamborghini. I grew up watching my mother work double shifts at a hospital laundry, and I promised her one day I'd own something nobody could take from me. That promise became a house in Cedar Ridge Estates, and later, a Huracan parked proudly in my driveway. My wife Alicia and I moved to Cedar Ridge for the schools, the quiet streets, and the manicured lawns that made the whole subdivision look like a postcard. Our daughter Zoe was 7, obsessed with butterflies, and thrilled about the pool 2 houses down. We weren't chasing status. We were chasing peace, something we'd both worked too hard for to take lightly. I bought the Lamborghini in cash, 6 months after making partner at the surgical group. It wasn't about flash. It was proof, to the boy I used to be, that hard work actually paid off. I never imagined that car would become the reason a woman I barely knew decided my family didn't belong on our own street. Cedar Ridge Estates had an HOA the way some towns have a church. Everyone answered to it whether they wanted to or not. Lawn heights, mailbox colors, holiday light schedules, all dictated by a thick binder of rules nobody remembered voting on. At the center of that binder sat Deborah Ashworth, HOA president for 11 consecutive years. Debbie, as she insisted people call her, ran board meetings like military briefings. She wore blazers to backyard barbecues and carried a clipboard the way other people carried purses. Neighbors joked about her behind closed doors, but nobody crossed her openly. She had a way of making disagreement feel like a personal insult. The subdivision itself was 94% white, a statistic I only learned later from a county demographic report. When we moved in, most neighbors were polite in that careful, distant way, waves from driveways, nothing more. Debbie, however, showed up on our second day with a fruit basket and a stack of HOA bylaws thicker than a phone book. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge," she said, eyes flicking past me toward the moving truck. "We like to keep things a certain way here." I thanked her, assuming it was standard HOA overreach. I didn't yet understand that for Debbie, a certain way had less to do with lawn care and everything to do with who she believed belonged. Her husband Roger was the opposite. Soft-spoken, apologetic, always trailing a step behind her like a shadow that had given up arguing. Their son Tyler, 24, still lived in the basement, a fact Debbie mentioned constantly while somehow making it sound like an accomplishment. Something about that family felt tightly wound, like a knot pulled too many times. I noticed small things early on. Other new families received a simple welcome card. We received a laminated packet titled Community Standards, highlighted in yellow, with sections on vehicle parking circled twice. I mentioned it to Alicia, who laughed it off. "Maybe she's just thorough," she said. I wanted to believe that too. Patricia and Gwyn lived across the street and became our first real friend on the block. She'd served on the HOA board for 2 years before quietly stepping back. "Debbie doesn't like change," Patricia told me over coffee one Saturday. "And she really doesn't like things she can't control." I filed that comment away, not yet understanding how prophetic it was. 6 weeks after we settled in, I bought the Huracan. I drove it home slowly, savoring the moment, imagining my late father seeing it. By the time I pulled into our driveway, 3 neighbors were already outside pretending to check their mailboxes, eyes locked on the car like it had personally offended them. Debbie was among them. She didn't smile. She stood at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed, studying the Lamborghini the way a customs agent studies a suspicious suitcase. I remember thinking, foolishly, that once she got used to seeing it, the staring would stop. Didn't. Within days, an anonymous complaint appeared in the HOA newsletter about unusual vehicles creating a distraction in the community. No names were mentioned, but everyone on the street knew exactly whose driveway it referenced. Alicia rolled her eyes. I tried to laugh it off too, though something uneasy had already begun settling in my chest. I later learned Debbie had photographed my car 11 times in the first month. Each image time-stamped and filed in a folder she kept on her kitchen counter labeled documentation. Patricia saw it once when she stopped by to drop off cookies. It looked like evidence for a court case, Patricia told me, half joking, half worried. At the next HOA meeting, Debbie proposed a new bylaw restricting high-value vehicles from being parked in driveways overnight, citing vague concerns about neighborhood character and property value perception. The room went quiet. 2 neighbors glanced at me. I raised my hand and asked whose vehicle, specifically, had prompted the proposal. Debbie's smile didn't reach her eyes. It's not about anyone specific. Marcus, she said, though she'd used my first name like we were old friends, which we weren't. The vote failed, 7-4. Mostly because half the board didn't want to admit their SUVs might also qualify as high value. Debbie's jaw tightened. I recognized that look. I'd seen it in patients who refused a diagnosis. I told myself it was nothing personal, just an overzealous woman clinging to outdated rules. I had built a career reading people under pressure, staying calm in operating rooms where panic cost lives. I figured I could handle one difficult neighbor. I had no idea Debbie Ashworth considered handling to be a battle she never lost. The real trouble started on a Tuesday morning in October. I was running late for a 7 a.m. surgery, jogging out to my car with my scrub bag half-zipped, when I saw Debbie standing directly beside the Lamborghini, phone raised, filming the license plate and the open garage behind it. "Can I help you?" I asked, more startled than angry. She lowered the phone slowly, unbothered, as if I'd interrupted her morning walk rather than caught her filming my property. "Just confirming vehicle registration matches the address on file," she said. "Community safety protocol. I'd lived there 4 months. Protocol." I asked to see the written policy. She said it was under review and would be emailed shortly. It never came, as a man was waiting on my operating table with a shattered femur, and I couldn't afford to carry anger into that room. Debbie, apparently, could afford to carry hers everywhere. 3 days later, I came home to find a bright orange sticker on my windshield reading, "Vehicle under review. Do not remove. No prior notice." No explanation. Plastered like a scarlet letter across the glass I'd spent 2 hours hand-waxing that same weekend. Alicia found me standing in the driveway, staring at it. "This has to be illegal," she said, snapping photos. I wasn't so sure it was illegal but I was certain it was targeted. No other car on the block wore a sticker like that. Not the neighbor's boat trailer. Not the Camaro 3 doors down. Not the pickup truck that blocked the sidewalk twice a week without consequence. I called the HOA office. The woman who answered, flustered, said Debbie had personally authorized the sticker, pending an ownership verification review. I asked what triggered the review. There was a long pause. Concern about the vehicle's origin, she finally said, choosing her words like she already knew how bad they sounded. Origin, I repeated. Like where it was manufactured? Another pause. I think she meant. The woman said quietly, almost apologetically. I hung up and sat in my car for a long moment, feeling something cold settle where confusion used to be. This wasn't about parking rules. This had never been about parking rules. Patricia confirmed my suspicion that evening over the fence separating our yards. She's been telling people you might not actually own that car, Patricia admitted, clearly uncomfortable. Said something about young men who borrow cars for the weekend to impress people. I felt my hands curl into fists I hadn't consciously made. I'm 42 years old. Was operated on children pulled from car accidents at 2 in the morning. And somehow, in Deborah Ashworth's mind, I had transformed into a young man who borrowed luxury cars to impress the neighbors. The insult wasn't just wrong. It was designed to diminish everything I'd built. I removed the sticker myself, carefully, and kept it as evidence, though I didn't yet know evidence of what. Alicia wanted to file a formal complaint immediately. I asked her to wait. The surgeon part wanted to observe the pattern longer before making an incision. I wanted to understand exactly what I was dealing with. What I was dealing with revealed itself 2 weeks later. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, when I came home early from a canceled consultation to find my garage door standing wide open and Deborah Ashworth's silhouette bent over the open frunk of my Lamborghini, rifling through the small storage compartment like it belonged to her. For a moment I just stood in the rain, unable to process what I was seeing. My neighbor, uninvited, in my garage, going through my car. She hadn't heard me pull up. She was too focused, pulling out a gym bag, unzipping it, checking the contents with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "What are you doing in my garage?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, echoing off the concrete walls. Debbie, startled, dropped the gym bag, and for one unguarded second I saw genuine fear flash across her face before it hardened back into that practiced, righteous calm she always wore like armor. "The garage door was open," she said, though I distinctly remembered closing it that morning, a habit drilled into me since childhood. I was concerned about a possible safety hazard. I looked at my gym bag, tossed carelessly on the concrete. Protein bars and a spare pair of running shoes spilled across the floor. "You were searching my car," I said flatly. "That's not a safety concern, Debbie. That's trespassing." Her chin lifted. "I have every right as HOA president to inspect properties flagged for community review." I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that HOA authority did not extend to warrantless searches of private vehicles. She smiled then, the kind of smile that made my stomach turn. "You'd be surprised what authority I have here, Marcus." She walked past me, unbothered, umbrella snapping open the moment she cleared the garage. I stood there in the rain-damp doorway, watching her cross the street back to her own house like nothing had happened at all. I called Patricia that night, hands still slightly unsteady. "She's done this before," Patricia admitted finally, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not to your car specifically, but to others. There was a family, the Hendersons, 2 years ago. They moved out within 6 months. Nobody really talks about why. I spent that weekend installing security cameras, 4 of them, covering the driveway, the garage entrance, and both sides of the house. Alicia thought I was overreacting. I told her I'd rather have footage I never needed than a repeat of that Thursday with no proof at all. I was, as it turned out, exactly right to prepare. The cameras caught Debbie within 10 days. Footage showed her walking slow, deliberate laps around my Lamborghini at 11:40 at night. Phone raised, circling twice before pausing at the driver's door and testing the handle. It didn't open. Twice, before glancing around and disappearing back across the street. I brought the footage to the HOA board meeting, expecting outrage, expecting accountability. Instead, Debbie stood up before I even finished speaking and announced that she'd been responding to a report of a suspicious vehicle idling in the neighborhood, and was simply checking for signs of forced entry into a parked car. Nobody on the board asked why forced entry would require testing a locked door handle at midnight. Nobody asked why the report had no timestamp, no caller ID, no record anywhere in the HOA's communication logs. They just nodded, the way people nod when they've decided a conversation is more trouble than it's worth. I left that meeting understanding something crucial. This wasn't going to be solved through official channels, at least not yet. Debbie had built 11 years of trust, favors, and quiet intimidation into a system that protected her by default. I would need more than one camera clip. I would need a pattern too obvious to ignore. Alicia suggested we simply move. The idea tempted me some nights, lying awake replaying the sound of Debbie's hand testing my car door. But something in me refused. I hadn't spent my whole life building this, the career, the house, the car, just to be chased out of it by a woman who couldn't stand seeing me succeed. Word started spreading through the neighborhood, the way it always does, half true and twice as damaging. Someone mentioned concerns about that new family's car at a book club meeting. Another neighbor asked Alicia, with false sweetness, whether we were renting or buying. Zoe came home from a playdate asking why a friend's mom seemed nervous around our house. I began keeping a written log alongside the camera footage, dates, times, incidents, quotes, as precisely as I documented patient charts. My brother James, a civil rights attorney in Atlanta, told me over the phone that patterns mattered more than single incidents in cases like this. Karens don't get caught on the first strike, he said. They get caught on the 20th. Debbie, meanwhile, escalated in ways that felt almost theatrical. She started a neighborhood watch group specifically for our street, printed flyers featuring a stock photo of a shadowy figure near a luxury car, and distributed them door to door. The flyer never named me directly. It didn't need to. Message underneath the message. At a 4th of July block party, she stood at the center of a small crowd and told a story about a car that didn't fit the neighborhood, driven by someone who clearly hadn't earned it the way the rest of us have. I stood 20 feet away, holding a paper plate of potato salad, listening to my life get rewritten as suspicion. Roger Ashworth caught my eye across the yard that afternoon, and for a brief second, something like apology crossed his face before he looked away and busied himself with the grill. I wondered, not for the first time, what it was like living inside Debbie's certainty, watching her reshape reality and never once objecting out loud. Tyler, their son, approached me near the drink table, oddly friendly for someone whose mother had just insulted me in front of 40 neighbors. "Nice car, man," he said, nodding toward my driveway visible from the yard. "My mom's just—" I asked what stuff like that meant exactly. He shrugged and walked away. I filed a formal complaint with the county HOA oversight board that week, attaching camera footage, timestamps, and a written summary of 11 distinct incidents spanning 4 months. The reviewing officer, a tired-sounding man named Delgado, told me these cases moved slowly. HOAs police themselves mostly, he admitted. "We usually only step in after something serious happens." Something serious, I would learn, was exactly what Debbie was building toward, piece by piece, though I couldn't yet see the full shape of it. Looking back, I recognize now that every small transgression was a rehearsal, each one testing how far she could push before consequences finally caught up with her. I just didn't know how far that was yet. Patricia pulled me aside one evening, glancing nervously at Debbie's house across the street before speaking. "She's been asking people about your background," Patricia whispered. "Where you're really from, what you did before medicine, whether anyone's actually seen your medical license." The word really landed like a slap, precise and deliberate in its cruelty. I hadn't hidden anything about my life. My credentials hung framed in my home office. My hospital badge sat clipped to my scrub top every single day. But Debbie wasn't looking for facts. She was searching for a story that fit the conclusion she'd already reached the moment she saw a black man driving a Lamborghini. That was the moment I understood the shape of what I was fighting. It wasn't really about the car. It had never really been about the car. It was about a woman who couldn't reconcile my success with her worldview, and who would rather manufacture a crime than accept she might simply be wrong about someone. I started sleeping less, replaying interactions, searching for what I might have done differently. Alicia noticed the toll it was taking and gently reminded me of something I told her years ago. During my hardest residency rotation, you don't win by matching their chaos. You win by staying so precise they can't find a crack to exploit. So I stayed precise. I stopped engaging Debbie directly whenever possible, letting my camera footage and written records speak instead. I kept my daughter shielded from as much of it as I could, though children absorb more than parents realize. And Zoe had started asking why the lady across the street doesn't like us. I told her the truth, simplified for a 7-year-old. Some people are scared of things they don't understand, and sometimes that fear makes them unkind. Zoe considered this for a long moment before asking, with the blunt clarity only children possess, "Is she scared of your car? Or scared of you?" I didn't have a good answer. By late summer, Debbie had shifted tactics again, this time targeting HOA fines instead of open confrontation. I received 4 violation notices in 2 weeks, mailbox height, an unapproved doormat, grass allegedly a 1/4 inch too tall, and, most absurdly, Excessive vehicle shine creating potential glare hazard for passing drivers. I laughed until I realized she was serious. Each fine came with an escalating dollar amount, and each one cited HOA code sections I later confirmed, with James's help, didn't actually exist in the official bylaws. Debbie was inventing violations faster than the board could verify them, betting correctly that most residents would simply pay rather than dispute a woman known for holding grudges. I didn't pay a single fine in writing, citing the specific bylaw numbers that proved her citations fabricated, attaching photos that directly contradicted her claims. The board went silent on 3 of the 4. The 4th, the mailbox height violation, mysteriously vanished from the system entirely, as if it had never been filed at all. Debbie's frustration became visible in small ways. A tightness in her voice at meetings, a new habit of driving past my house slower than necessary, sometimes twice in one evening. I began to sense she was no longer operating from a place of policy, however twisted, but from something more personal, more desperate, and more dangerous. James flew down for a weekend to review my documentation in person. He sat at my kitchen table for 6 hours, cross-referencing footage against HOA meeting minutes he'd requested through a public records process. "This isn't just harassment anymore," he said finally, sliding a folder across the table. "This is a pattern with a target. That matters legally." He explained that isolated incidents were easy for institutions to dismiss as misunderstandings, but a documented pattern spanning months, escalating steadily, aimed specifically at one resident, painted a very different legal picture. "Keep doing exactly what you're doing," he told me. "Precise, calm, documented. Let her be the one who loses control on camera." I didn't have to wait long. Visit. I left for a medical conference in Chicago, a 5-day trip Alicia and Zoe stayed home for. I mentioned it casually to a neighbor while checking my mail, unaware that conversation would travel, as neighborhood conversations always did, directly back to Debbie's kitchen table within hours. On the second night of my trip, my security system sent an alert to my phone at 1:47 a.m. I opened the app from my hotel room, heart already pounding before the footage even loaded. Some instinct warning me what I was about to see confirmed exactly what I feared. Debbie Ashworth, alone, standing beside my locked Lamborghini. This time she wasn't just circling. She had a flashlight, a small toolkit, and what appeared to be a Slim Jim, the kind of device used to manually unlock older vehicle doors. My hands went cold watching the grainy footage. This was no longer questionable HOA overreach. This was, unmistakably, attempted breaking and entering. I called the police immediately, then called Alicia to make sure she and Zoe were safe inside with the doors locked. The responding officer, a young woman named Reyes, reviewed the footage on my phone and confirmed what I already knew. "This is enough for a report," she said. "Possibly enough for charges, depending on what she was after." Debbie was questioned briefly on her own porch that night. Footage from Officer Reyes's body camera later showing her claim, unconvincingly, that she'd heard a strange noise and was simply checking for prowlers. When asked why she brought a Slim Jim to check for prowlers, she had no answer, just a long, uncomfortable silence. No charges were filed that night, insufficient evidence of intent. The department said, since the car remained locked and nothing was stolen. But the report existed now, official and dated, a permanent record contradicting every future claim Debbie might make about simply checking on community safety. I flew home the next morning, unable to focus on the conference at all. When I arrived, Alicia met me at the door, pale and exhausted. "She's been by twice since it happened," Alicia said, both times acting like nothing occurred. Once she even asked if we'd heard anything unusual the other night. I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. Hearing that was the moment I stopped hoping Debbie would eventually back down on her own. Some people recalibrate when confronted with consequences. Debbie, I now understood, simply recalibrated her strategy instead, adjusting her methods while keeping the same relentless goal, proving, by any means necessary, that I didn't belong in Cedar Ridge Estates. I filed a formal police report the next morning and requested Debbie be barred from HOA presidential duties pending investigation. The board, finally uncomfortable enough to act, scheduled an emergency meeting. Debbie arrived 20 minutes late, composed, dressed sharply, and immediately reframed the entire narrative before anyone else could speak first. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding about my late-night safety patrol," she began, and I watched, almost impressed despite myself, as she transformed attempted vehicle entry into a heroic act of neighborhood vigilance. Two board members visibly relaxed. Patricia, sitting beside me, muttered under her breath, "She's done this before too." I played the security footage on the projector screen without warning, letting the image speak instead of my words. The room went silent watching Debbie test my car door with a Slim Jim at nearly 2 in the morning. Her composure cracked, just slightly, a flush spreading up her neck before she recovered and insisted context was missing. "What context?" I asked. "Explains bringing a lock-picking tool to check for a noise?" She had no answer that didn't sound absurd out loud, though she tried 3 different versions of one anyway. The board voted, uneasily, to suspend her presidential authority pending further review. It wasn't the ending I wanted, but it was a beginning. Debbie didn't accept the suspension quietly. She sent a mass email to the entire subdivision that night, painting herself as the victim of a targeted smear campaign and vaguely implying I'd fabricated the footage. Several longtime residents, loyal to her after over a decade of leadership, rallied publicly to her defense within hours. For the first time since we'd moved to Cedar Ridge, I felt the full weight of being outnumbered, of watching a community choose comfortable loyalty over uncomfortable truth. Alicia held my hand at the kitchen table that night and said quietly, "This isn't over. It's just getting harder before it gets better." I wanted badly to believe her. The suspension brought an unexpected lull. Debbie kept a lower profile for nearly 3 weeks. No late-night visits. No fabricated violations. No lingering stares from her driveway. I almost let myself relax, telling Alicia maybe the police report and board vote had finally taught her a real lesson about boundaries and consequences. Patricia warned me not to mistake silence for surrender. "She's regrouping," Patricia said flatly over coffee one morning. "I've watched her do this before. With other people, other issues. She goes quiet right before she goes nuclear." I filed the warning away, wanting to believe this time might be different, knowing deep down it probably wasn't. During that quiet stretch, I focused on rebuilding some sense of normalcy for Zoe, who'd started drawing pictures of the mean lady in her sketchbook without prompting. We took a weekend trip to the mountains, just the three of us, and for 2 days I almost forgot Cedar Ridge Estates existed at all. James called during that lull with updates from his own research. He'd discovered, through public HOA financial filings, some irregularities in Cedar Ridge's annual budget reports dating back nearly 3 years. Categories that didn't quite balance. Expenditures without clear documentation. Might be nothing, he cautioned. Might be something. I mentioned this to Patricia carefully, not wanting to spread unfounded rumors of my own. Her expression shifted immediately, something like recognition crossing her face. The community fund, she said slowly. There's been chatter for years about where exactly that money goes. Nobody's ever pushed hard enough to find out. I didn't push either. Not yet. I had enough on my plate defending my family's basic dignity without opening an entirely separate investigation. But I filed the information away, the way I'd learned to file everything now, sensing somehow it might matter later, even if I couldn't yet see exactly how the pieces connected. The board scheduled a formal hearing to determine whether Debbie's suspension would become permanent. She requested a 2-week postponement, citing a family emergency. The board granted it without objection. I remember feeling uneasy about that delay, some instinct warning me she wasn't preparing an apology. She was preparing something else entirely. During those 2 weeks, Roger Ashworth's car disappeared from their driveway for 4 consecutive days. When it returned, he looked thinner, quieter than usual, avoiding eye contact whenever our paths crossed at the mailbox. I didn't know yet what had happened inside that house, but something clearly had, something significant. Tyler also became a more frequent presence outside, though not in any friendly capacity. I noticed him watching my house some evenings from across the street, phone occasionally raised in my direction. When I mentioned it to Alicia, she'd already noticed too. It feels like they're building a file on us, she said quietly. Patricia confirmed my suspicion during our next conversation. Debbie's telling people she's compiling evidence for her hearing, Patricia said. Not evidence about the car door incident. Evidence about you. Your finances. She hired someone, apparently, a private investigator. I sat with that information for a long time before responding. Why would she need a private investigator for an HOA hearing about her own behavior? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the honest answer. Patricia shrugged helplessly. Because for Debbie, this stopped being about the HOA rules a long time ago. This is about proving she was right about you all along. I called James that night, and for the first time since this began, I heard genuine concern in his voice rather than measured legal calm. If she's digging into your personal history without cause, that's a different kind of problem, he said. That's not overreach anymore. That starts looking like a targeted campaign. We increased security around the house that week. Additional cameras. Motion lighting along the side yard. A doorbell camera with wider range. Alicia started keeping Zoe's schedule slightly more private, avoiding mentioning our whereabouts to neighbors we didn't fully trust anymore. Our quiet neighborhood had begun feeling less like sanctuary and more like siege. The lull ended exactly the way Patricia predicted. Abruptly and without warning. 4 days before the scheduled hearing. When Debbie showed up unannounced at my hospital, waiting in the surgical wing lobby, asking the front desk whether Dr. Webb actually held valid credentials or was simply using the title informally. A colleague called me out of a consultation to handle the situation, understandably confused about why a stranger was questioning my medical license at my own workplace. I found Debbie standing near the reception desk, oddly calm, as if she hadn't just committed a bizarre and humiliating act of harassment in my professional life. "I just wanted to confirm things for the hearing," she said, unbothered by the security guard now standing beside her. "People deserve to know exactly who they're dealing with." I asked her, quietly, professionally, to leave hospital property immediately or I would have her escorted out and file a formal complaint with hospital administration. She left, but not before loudly announcing to the waiting room, "I hope everyone here knows their surgeon's credentials before they let him operate." 2 patients exchanged uncomfortable glances. My department head later told me 3 separate people asked administration, unprompted, to confirm my board certification following that incident. The damage, though small, was real. I filed a restraining order request that afternoon, the first time I'd taken that step, and James flew back down immediately to help prepare documentation. The judge granted a temporary order within 48 hours, citing the pattern of escalating behavior clearly established across police reports, HOA complaints, and now workplace harassment. Debbie was legally barred from approaching my hospital, my home beyond neighborly proximity, and any direct contact with my family. I thought, foolishly, that a court order might finally create the boundary nothing else had. I underestimated, once again, exactly how far someone convinced of their own righteousness would go to avoid losing. For days later, at the rescheduled HOA hearing, Debbie arrived with a folder thick enough to be a small manuscript. She'd apparently spent the restraining order's first week compiling everything her private investigator had gathered, determined to present it publicly before the board could formally strip her position away for good. The hearing room was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen at a single HOA event. Drawn by curiosity, gossip, or genuine concern about where this conflict was heading. Alicia sat beside me, Zoe safely at her grandmother's for the evening. James sat on my other side, quietly organizing our own documentation. Debbie opened by acknowledging the restraining order, framing it as a misunderstanding born from genuine community concern, and then pivoted immediately into her prepared material,
claiming she'd uncovered serious inconsistencies in my background that
she projected a document onto the screen, a printout she claimed showed discrepancies in my medical licensing records. James, ever prepared, immediately requested the source of the document. Debbie hesitated. She said vaguely. James asked for the researcher's name and licensing credentials. She didn't have an answer. I calmly pulled up my actual license verification on the State Medical Board's public website, displaying it beside her printout for direct comparison. The discrepancy she'd highlighted turned out to be nothing more than a minor formatting difference between an old license number format and the state's updated digital system. Completely explainable and entirely legitimate. Murmurs rippled through the room. Debbie pressed forward anyway, undeterred, moving to her next claim, that my Lamborghini's registration showed irregular financing patterns, suggesting it might have been obtained fraudulently. I simply handed the board my purchase documentation. Cash payment confirmed. Title clean. Nothing irregular about it whatsoever. Her third claim, the most desperate yet, suggested I'd falsified information on my HOA application regarding employment history. I produced my hospital employment contract, dated years before we'd even moved to Cedar Ridge, directly contradicting her timeline entirely. Each claim collapsed faster than the last, and I watched her composure begin visibly fracturing. "You're all missing the point," Debbie finally snapped, voice rising for the first time that evening. "Something about him doesn't add up. I can feel it." That particular silence that follows someone accidentally revealing the truth underneath their carefully constructed argument. She'd stopped pretending this was about facts. Board member Harold Simmons, quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. "Deborah, you've presented 3 claims tonight, and all 3 were false. At what point does feeling something doesn't add up stop being community concern and start being exactly what Dr. Webb's restraining order petition described?" Nobody had an immediate answer. The board voted that night to permanently remove Debbie from any HOA leadership position, effective immediately. She sat frozen for a moment, staring at the vote tally, before standing abruptly and walking out without a word, folder still clutched against her chest like evidence for a case that no longer existed. I thought, sitting in my car afterward with Alicia's hand in mine, that this might finally be the end of it. Formal removal from leadership. A restraining order in place. Documented, undeniable proof of fabricated claims. Surely, I thought, even Debbie Ashworth would recognize when a battle had been thoroughly lost. I was wrong. For sale signs appeared on 3 lawns near ours. Neighbors Debbie had apparently convinced that our presence made the neighborhood unsafe, citing vague warnings about ongoing legal issues without specifics. It wasn't true. The currency Debbie traded in. Patricia told me Debbie was now operating outside official channels entirely, hosting small gatherings at her own house, rallying a shrinking but loyal circle of longtime residents who still trusted her judgment over evidence. "She's not done," Patricia warned.
"Removed from leadership just means..."
That warning proved prophetic 2 weeks later, when Alicia discovered someone had slashed one of our car tires overnight. Not the Lamborghini, thankfully secured in the locked garage, but her own sedan, parked in the driveway. No camera captured a clear face, just a hooded figure moving quickly through darkness at 3 a.m. The build was slight, average height, moving with a familiarity that suggested someone who knew our property layout well. Officer Reyes, reviewing the footage again, noted the figure avoided every camera's direct line of sight except one blind spot near the side fence. A blind spot that wouldn't be obvious to a random stranger. "Someone who knew your camera placement did this," she said carefully. I thought immediately of Tyler, standing across the street those evenings, phone raised toward our house, presumably mapping exactly what he was documenting. I couldn't prove it, not yet, but the suspicion settled into my chest like a stone I couldn't dislodge. James suggested widening our own investigation, quietly, carefully, focusing specifically on Tyler's recent activity and financial situation, since patterns of harassment often trace back through family members eager to prove loyalty. What we found over the following 2 weeks reshaped everything I thought I understood about the Ashworth family. Tyler had 2 prior arrests, both sealed as a minor but referenced in a local news archive from an unrelated case where his name appeared as a witness. One was for vandalism. The other, more troubling, involved a restraining order filed by a former girlfriend citing harassment and property damage. History seemed repeated itself. Debbie, turned out, had spent considerable effort over the years keeping Tyler's record quiet, including, according to a source Patricia connected me with, borrowing funds from somewhere to cover legal fees that never appeared on any public HOA expenditure report. The pieces James had found earlier suddenly started forming a clearer picture. I brought this information to Officer Reyes. Carefully, factually, without accusation, simply laying out the pattern and asking whether it warranted further police attention regarding the tire incident. She confirmed she'd add Tyler as a person of interest, though without direct evidence. She couldn't yet pursue formal charges against him. Debbie, apparently sensing the investigation's direction through whatever remained of her neighborhood network, showed up at our door 3 nights later, violating the restraining order's proximity clause by standing on our porch steps, demanding to know why the police were harassing her innocent son over a simple tire. I didn't open the door. The camera footage capturing every second of her 10-minute tirade on our porch, voice rising steadily as she alternated between threats and tearful pleas for me to just leave her family alone. The restraining order violation was undeniable, captured in crisp high definition. She was arrested that night for violating the court order, released the following morning on minor bail, facing a court date that would now include this incident alongside the growing file James had been building. Even then, standing in handcuffs on her own lawn according to a neighbor who witnessed it, she insisted she'd done nothing wrong. Roger filed for divorce 11 days later. Patricia heard it from a mutual friend still speaking to Roger, who described him as finally done watching her destroy everything around her, including their own family. I felt no satisfaction hearing this, only a tired kind of sadness for a marriage clearly broken long before I ever arrived. Tyler, meanwhile, disappeared from the neighborhood entirely for nearly 2 weeks. Address unknown. Phone apparently disconnected. James suggested this wasn't retreat but repositioning, and warned me the quiet period ahead might be more dangerous than any of Debbie's previous public confrontations, precisely because we could no longer see what was coming. I doubled our home security once more, installed a panic button system directly linked to local police dispatch, and started varying my driving routes to and from the hospital, a level of caution that felt absurd for a man simply trying to live peacefully in the house he'd worked his entire life to afford. Alicia, understandably shaken, suggested again that we consider selling and starting fresh somewhere Debbie's shadow couldn't reach us. This time I listened more seriously, genuinely weighing whether staying was worth the toll it continued taking on our family. On Zoe, who now flinched at unexpected knocks on the door. What kept me from leaving, ultimately, wasn't stubbornness alone. It was a growing certainty, fed by everything James and Patricia had uncovered, that Debbie's collapse was already underway, that the financial irregularities, the fabricated claims, the restraining order violation, were all converging toward something the community would eventually have to reckon with fully. I wasn't wrong to sense that convergence. though I underestimated how quickly and how dramatically it would arrive. What I didn't yet know was that Debbie, cornered, humiliated, and facing genuine legal consequences for the first time in over a decade of unchecked authority, was preparing one final, desperate move to reclaim control. That move began quietly. Through a series of forged documents Debbie apparently submitted to the county, attempting to file a formal complaint against my medical license with the state board, this time using fabricated patient testimony rather than easily disproven paperwork discrepancies. It was a different tactic. It was also a felony. A state investigator contacted me directly, professional and measured, explaining that an anonymous complaint had triggered a routine review, standard procedure regardless of the complaint's ultimate credibility. I wasn't worried about the outcome. My record was clean and thoroughly documented. But the sheer audacity of the attempt left me genuinely stunned. The investigator, working the case independently, traced the complaint's originating email back to an IP address registered at a public library 3 miles from Cedar Ridge Estates, accessed during a specific time window that, according to library security footage James later subpoenaed, showed Debbie Ashworth using that exact computer terminal, filing a fraudulent complaint against a medical license, using fabricated patient information, constituted a serious criminal offense, far more severe than anything Debbie had attempted previously. When investigators confronted her with the library footage, she reportedly denied everything initially, then grew increasingly erratic during questioning. According to a source close to the investigation, this was, I believe now, the moment Debbie fully lost whatever remained of her careful control. The restraining order violation had been impulsive, born from genuine desperation defending her son. This new attempt was calculated, premeditated, executed with clear intent to destroy my career entirely. It revealed exactly how far she was willing to go. James filed additional civil claims immediately, expanding our case to include this new fraudulent complaint alongside the existing harassment pattern. "This isn't overreach anymore," he told me during a late-night call. "This is someone actively trying to end your livelihood because she can't accept being wrong." The law takes that very seriously. I tried to focus on work during this period, on patients who needed steady hands and clear judgment regardless of what chaos surrounded my personal life. Some mornings that focus came easily, muscle memory carrying me through procedures I'd performed hundreds of times. Other mornings, I sat in my car outside the hospital, just breathing. Patricia became an unexpected anchor throughout this stretch, checking in most evenings, sharing whatever fragments of neighborhood information filtered through her remaining connections. "People are starting to see it now," she told me one night. "Even her old loyalists. You can't keep explaining away this many incidents forever." That shift became visible at the following HOA meeting, sparsely attended compared to previous gatherings, but noticeably different in tone. Neighbors who'd once defended Debbie now sat quietly, uncomfortable, several avoiding eye contact entirely when her name came up during unrelated agenda items about landscaping budgets and pool maintenance schedules. Harold Simmons, still on the board, proposed formally banning Debbie from HOA property entirely, citing the accumulated pattern of harassment, the restraining order, and now the pending criminal investigation into the fraudulent licensing complaint. The vote passed unanimously this time, including from residents who'd previously abstained out of loyalty or fear. I should have felt vindicated. Mostly I felt exhausted. The particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent months defending basic truths that should never have required defending in the first place. Alicia noticed the toll clearly, gently suggesting therapy, which I eventually agreed to, recognizing even surgeons need help processing sustained trauma sometimes. Debbie's court date for the restraining order violation arrived during this period, and she appeared visibly diminished, none of her usual sharp composure evident as she stood before the judge. The judge extended the restraining order significantly, added mandatory anger management counseling, and issued a stern warning about further violations carrying jail time. She left the courthouse that day without acknowledging me at all, a stark contrast to the woman who'd once filmed my license plate with theatrical confidence. Something had visibly broken in her, though I couldn't yet tell whether it was genuine remorse or simply the exhaustion of finally facing consequences she'd avoided for years. Turned out to be neither. The state medical board investigation concluded, finding the complaint against me entirely fabricated and formally referring the matter to county prosecutors for potential criminal charges related to filing false official documents, a felony carrying real prison time under state law. The criminal complaint became public record almost immediately, and local news picked up the story within days. Drawn by the unusual specifics, an HOA president facing felony charges for filing fraudulent claims against a surgeon neighbor. Reporters called our house repeatedly. I declined every interview, unwilling to turn our family's ordeal into entertainment. Debbie, however, seemed almost energized by the media attention, granting an interview to a local station where she framed herself as a whistleblower silenced for raising legitimate community concerns. Watching that interview, calm and articulate on camera despite pending felony charges, I understood something important about how deeply she believed her own narrative. That interview backfired spectacularly. A local investigative reporter, intrigued by Debbie's claims, began digging into her broader HOA history and stumbled onto exactly what James had flagged months earlier: significant, unexplained gaps in the Cedar Ridge Community Fund spanning nearly 3 years of Debbie's unchecked financial oversight as president. The reporter contacted Patricia, who by now had grown willing to speak openly about her concerns from her earlier board tenure. Patricia's account, combined with the reporter's own document requests through public records law, revealed a financial picture far more damaging than anyone in the neighborhood, myself included, had fully anticipated. Nearly $90,000 had vanished from Cedar Ridge's Community Reserve Fund over 3 years, categorized under vague expenditure labels like landscaping consultation and administrative services that traced back to shell vendors with no verifiable business address, no employees, and no actual services ever documented as delivered to the community. Debbie, facing this new revelation, abandoned any pretense of composure entirely. She began appearing erratically around the neighborhood at odd hours, once knocking on Patricia's door at midnight demanding to know who talked to that reporter, violating not just basic decency but, as it turned out, a court order she'd already been warned about repeatedly. She started making thinly veiled threats on a community Facebook group, warning unnamed traitors that they'd regret betraying someone who'd given 11 years to this neighborhood. Several residents screenshotted the posts before Debbie deleted her account entirely, but the damage and the evidence was already permanently preserved by that point. I received a call from the reporter, a woman named Christine Okafor, requesting comment on the broader pattern she'd uncovered. I agreed to speak, cautiously, providing factual documentation rather than emotional commentary, letting the timeline itself illustrate the severity of what our family and, apparently, the entire community had endured under Debbie's leadership. Christine's article published 2 days later, comprehensive and carefully sourced, connecting the harassment campaign against my family to the broader financial mismanagement, painting a picture of someone who'd used 11 years of unchecked authority to serve personal grudges and now appeared, personal financial gain at the community's direct expense. The article spread quickly through local social media, then regional news outlets picking up the story for its unusual combination of elements: racial profiling, financial embezzlement, felony fraud charges, all centered around one HOA president's unraveling authority. Cedar Ridge Estates, once a quiet postcard subdivision, suddenly found itself an unwilling local headline. Debbie's response to the growing scrutiny was, characteristically, escalation rather than retreat. Neighbors reported seeing her car circling the block repeatedly at odd hours, sometimes stopping directly in front of our house before driving off again without explanation, a pattern unsettling enough that Officer Reyes assigned periodic patrol checks to our street. One patrol check, 3 nights after the article published, caught Debbie parked directly across from our driveway at 2 in the morning, engine off, lights out, watching our house through binoculars according to the responding officer's report. This violated her restraining order unambiguously, triggering an immediate arrest, this time without bail consideration. The judge, reviewing the accumulated pattern, the original harassment, the fraudulent medical board complaint, the multiple restraining order violations, now including nighttime surveillance, denied bail entirely, citing genuine concern for my family's safety. Debbie would remain in county custody until her combined court dates could be scheduled and heard. I felt something complicated sitting with that news. Relief tangled uncomfortably with something almost like sorrow for the family collateral damage surrounding her collapse. Roger, already divorced and living quietly elsewhere. Tyler, whereabouts still unclear. And Debbie herself, a woman whose entire identity had apparently been built on control, now utterly, completely powerless. James reminded me, gently but firmly, that sympathy for her circumstances shouldn't overshadow accountability for her actions. She built this entirely herself, he said. Every single choice, from the first illegal search to the fraudulent felony complaint, was hers alone. Feeling something for her situation doesn't mean she didn't earn these consequences. He was right, though understanding that intellectually didn't fully quiet the discomfort I felt watching someone's life implode this thoroughly, even someone who'd spent months trying to destroy mine. Alicia, less conflicted than me, simply said, she made her choices when nobody was watching. Now everybody's watching the results. The embezzlement investigation expanded rapidly once county auditors got involved, examining Cedar Ridge's financial records alongside 2 neighboring HOAs. Debbie had also served on committees for years earlier, revealing what investigators described as a consistent pattern extending well beyond our own subdivision's compromised community reserve fund. Tyler resurfaced during this period, located by investigators in a neighboring county, where he'd apparently been staying with the same former girlfriend who'd previously filed a restraining order against him years earlier, a detail that added an uncomfortable layer of complexity to an already troubling family history. He was questioned regarding both the tire slashing incident at our house and potential knowledge of his mother's financial activities. He denied involvement in the tire incident specifically, though investigators noted inconsistencies in his timeline that kept him listed as a person of interest pending further evidence collection efforts. Roger, reached separately by investigators for his own testimony regarding the community fund, provided what turned out to be crucial documentation, years of joint bank statements, showing unexplained deposits coinciding suspiciously with HOA fund withdrawals, evidence he'd apparently kept quietly filed away long before their divorce. Uncertain what to do with it. "I didn't want to believe it," Roger reportedly told investigators, according to Christine's follow-up reporting. "You convince yourself there's an explanation, especially when it's someone you've been married to for 26 years. Eventually the explanations just stop making sense anymore, no matter how much you want them to." That testimony became pivotal, corroborating the paper trail auditors had already assembled independently. Combined with the library computer footage, the fraudulent medical board complaint, and the multiple documented restraining order violations, prosecutors now possessed what James described as an overwhelming case, more comprehensive than most HOA-related prosecutions ever see. The community, meanwhile, reeled from the scale of what had happened under their collective noses for years. A special HOA meeting drew nearly every resident on the street, many expressing genuine shock, others quietly admitting they'd sensed something was wrong but never felt empowered enough to challenge Debbie's authority directly. Harold Simmons, addressing the packed room, acknowledged the board's own failures in allowing unchecked authority to persist for over a decade. "We should have asked more questions," he said. "We should have demanded transparency years ago. Dr. paid the price for our collective silence. And that's on all of us." I appreciated the acknowledgement, though it arrived considerably later than would have prevented months of documented harassment. A slashed tire, a fraudulent felony complaint threatening my medical career, and countless sleepless nights for my wife and daughter. Accountability, however overdue, still mattered. But it couldn't undo what had already happened. Zoe, now understanding more of the situation than we'd initially intended, asked one evening whether the mean lady would ever come back to hurt us again. I told her honestly that the woman was facing serious consequences for her choices, that the people whose job it was to protect us were doing exactly that. "Is that what happens when people are mean on purpose?" Zoe asked, and I found myself genuinely moved by the simple clarity of her question, wishing adult conflicts could always resolve with such straightforward moral logic. "Sometimes," I told her. "Not always fast enough. But sometimes. Eventually, yes." Debbie's combined court proceedings were scheduled for the following month, consolidating the restraining order violations, the fraudulent medical board complaint felony charge, and, pending final investigation results, potential embezzlement charges related to the missing community funds. James confirmed the prosecutor intended to pursue maximum applicable penalties given the pattern's severity. In the weeks leading up to those proceedings, I focused on rebuilding whatever normalcy remained possible. We removed the extra security cameras that had made our home feel more like a fortress than a sanctuary. Zoe started sleeping through the night again without asking to check the locks twice before bed. Patricia and I grew closer through the ordeal, An unexpected friendship forged through shared vigilance against someone who'd once controlled our entire street through fear and false authority. "I should have spoken up years ago," she admitted one evening. "I told myself it wasn't my fight. I was wrong about that." I told her what I genuinely believed, that speaking up against someone like Debbie required exactly the kind of courage most people, understandably, struggle to summon without a very specific breaking point. She'd found hers eventually. That mattered more than the delay, even if the delay had cost real damage along the way. The auditor's final report arrived 3 weeks before Debbie's trial date, confirming embezzlement totaling just over $112,000 across 3 separate HOA communities she'd served during her tenure, funds diverted through shell vendors, falsified invoices, and, in several instances, direct transfers to personal accounts disguised as reimbursements. This report transformed the case's scale entirely, elevating charges from a single fraudulent complaint against my medical license into a comprehensive prosecution encompassing years of systematic financial crime alongside targeted harassment. Prosecutors announced they'd be seeking significant prison time, a stark departure from the community service outcomes typical in most HOA-related disputes. I received word through James that Debbie's legal team had approached prosecutors about a plea deal, hoping to minimize potential sentencing by admitting guilt to reduce charges. Prosecutors declined the initial offer, citing the severity and duration of the pattern, along with what they described as a demonstrated absence of genuine remorse. That absence of remorse became publicly evident during a pretrial hearing, when Debbie, given opportunity to address the court briefly, instead used her time to reiterate claims about community concerns regarding my presence in the neighborhood, seemingly unable, even facing felony charges, to fully abandon the narrative she'd constructed months earlier. The judge interrupted her mid-statement, reminding her sharply that the hearing concerned specific documented crimes, not her personal opinions about a neighbor's suitability for residence. Debbie fell silent, visibly rattled by the rebuke, perhaps beginning, finally, to understand how thoroughly her constructed reality had diverged from the actual facts everyone else could see. James told me afterward that moment likely damaged her case significantly, providing prosecutors additional evidence of unrepentant motive directly from her own testimony. "She keeps handing them exactly what they need," he said, something between exasperation and disbelief in his voice.
"I've genuinely never seen a defense."
Christine's reporting continued throughout this period, each new development drawing renewed attention to Cedar Ridge Estates, transforming our quiet subdivision into something of a cautionary case study referenced in broader conversations about HOA overreach, racial profiling in residential communities, and the dangers of unchecked institutional authority left unexamined for too long. I received messages from strangers across the country, some sharing similar experiences with their own HOAs, others simply expressing support after reading Christine's coverage. It was strange, uncomfortable even, becoming a symbol of something larger than my own personal ordeal, though I understood why the story resonated beyond our single street. Alicia handled the increased attention better than I expected, using it as an opportunity to speak publicly, carefully, about the emotional toll sustained harassment takes on families, particularly families of color navigating predominantly white communities where institutional authority too often defaults to protecting the accuser rather than the accused. Zoe's school counselor reached out after noticing some anxiety in her classroom behavior, offering additional support resources we gratefully accepted. Healing, I was learning, extended well beyond simply winning the legal and factual battles against Debbie. It required actively rebuilding the sense of safety her campaign had systematically dismantled. 2 weeks before trial, Roger reached out to me directly for the first time since everything began. A brief, awkward phone call where he apologized, somewhat haltingly, for not stepping in sooner and for staying quiet too long, while his wife's behavior escalated into genuine criminal territory affecting my family's safety. I appreciated the gesture, though I made clear his apology, while meaningful, didn't erase the months of harm his silence had allowed to continue unchecked. He seemed to understand that distinction, thanking me for the conversation regardless, before mentioning quietly that he'd be testifying for the prosecution regarding the financial evidence. Tyler was formally charged separately for the tire slashing incident, evidence eventually connecting him definitively through a partial fingerprint recovered from our fence, combined with cell phone location data placing him near our property during the exact time frame captured on camera. He accepted a plea deal, avoiding trial but receiving probation and community service. As Debbie's trial date approached, the community held its collective breath, uncertain exactly how this saga, which had consumed Cedar Ridge estates for nearly a year, would ultimately resolve. I found myself, despite everything, wanting simple resolution more than dramatic vindication, some clear ending that let us all finally move forward. James warned me trials rarely provided the tidy closure people hoped for, that legal proceedings moved slower and messier than the narratives constructed around them. He was right, mostly, though what actually happened during those final proceedings delivered something closer to poetic justice than either of us genuinely expected going in. The morning of the consolidated hearing, walking into the courthouse with Alicia and James beside me, I felt strangely calm, the particular calm that comes after months of sustained anxiety finally approaching its resolution, regardless of which direction that resolution ultimately took. Whatever happened next, the waiting itself was almost over. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters, neighbors, curious community members drawn by months of local coverage. Christine sat near the front with her notepad ready. Patricia squeezed my hand briefly before taking her seat, a small gesture of solidarity that meant more than she probably realized after everything we'd both endured. Prosecutors opened by walking the judge through the comprehensive timeline James had helped assemble months earlier. The initial illegal search, the fabricated HOA violations, the attempted vehicle break-in, the hospital harassment, the fraudulent medical board complaint, and finally, the extensive financial embezzlement spanning 3 separate community associations over multiple years. Debbie's defense attorney attempted to argue diminished culpability, suggesting years of unpaid, thankless HOA service had gradually eroded her judgment, that she genuinely believed her actions served legitimate community protection rather than personal vendetta. It was, I thought, watching her deliver this argument, the most generous possible framing of pure malice. The prosecution's rebuttal was methodical, playing security footage of the midnight break-in attempt, the hospital lobby confrontation captured on security cameras, and finally, financial records showing embezzled funds directly deposited into accounts used for personal luxury purchases entirely unrelated to any HOA business whatsoever. I testified that afternoon, walking the court through my own experience, the surveillance, the fabricated violations, the illegal search of my Lamborghini, the professional harassment at my workplace, and the fear that had reshaped my family's daily life for nearly a year. I kept my testimony factual, precise, letting evidence carry the emotional weight. Cross-examination attempted to paint me as overreacting to standard neighborhood tensions, a framing that fell apart quickly once the accumulated documentation, restraining order violations, and criminal charges spoke plainly for themselves. Even Debbie's own attorney seemed to recognize the weakness of that particular defensive angle by the questioning's end. Patricia testified next, describing years of witnessing Debbie's controlling leadership style, including the earlier incident with the Henderson family that had prompted their quiet departure from Cedar Ridge years before I'd ever moved in. That testimony established, crucially, that this pattern predated my arrival, undermining any claim I'd somehow provoked unusual behavior. Roger's testimony followed, quiet and clearly difficult for him, walking through the financial discrepancies he'd discovered, the deposits, the shell vendor invoices, the gradual realization his wife had been systematically stealing from the very community she claimed to protect so fiercely for over a decade of leadership. The courtroom grew notably tense during his testimony. The weight of watching a marriage's private collapse play out in such public, documented detail. Debbie sat motionless throughout, staring at the table in front of her. None of the sharp composure or righteous certainty that had defined her for so many months anywhere visible now. Christine's earlier reporting was entered into evidence as well, corroborating the timeline through independently verified public records requests. The prosecution's case, comprehensive and methodically documented across nearly a year, painted an undeniable portrait of sustained harassment intertwined with significant, deliberate financial crime affecting an entire community's shared trust and resources. During a recess, I stepped outside the courthouse for air and unexpectedly encountered Debbie's court-appointed counselor from her earlier mandated anger management sessions, waiting to testify about her progress, or lack thereof, during those mandated sessions following the initial restraining order violation months earlier. She never once acknowledged wrongdoing in our sessions, the counselor told me, unprompted, perhaps recognizing me from news coverage. Every session, she framed herself as the victim of some conspiracy. I've rarely seen someone so thoroughly unable to recognize their own role in their circumstances. I thanked her for sharing that, unsurprised. When proceedings resumed, that counselor's testimony confirmed exactly what she told me privately, providing the court additional professional insight into Debbie's persistent lack of accountability throughout the mandated counseling process, undermining any remaining argument for leniency based on genuine remorse or meaningful behavioral change during that period. The defense's final argument leaned heavily on Debbie's 11 years of otherwise unblemished community service, requesting the court weigh that history against what they characterized as an isolated period of poor judgment. The prosecution countered simply by noting that 11 years of authority was precisely what enabled years of undetected theft. Closing arguments concluded by early evening, and the judge announced sentencing would be delivered the following morning after reviewing the full body of evidence overnight. We left the courthouse exhausted, the accumulated weight of nearly a year's ordeal finally approaching its formal conclusion. One way or another, within hours. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion, I sat on our back porch replaying the entire timeline in my mind, the fruit basket disguising suspicion, the orange sticker, the midnight Slim Jim, the hospital lobby confrontation, the slashed tire, the fraudulent complaint threatening my career. So much damage from one person's certainty. Alicia joined me quietly, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders against the cool evening air. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "we survived this. Zoe's safe. We're still here. Still together." I held on to that truth, letting it steady me against whatever verdict the morning would bring. We arrived at the courthouse early, the gallery filling quickly with familiar faces. Patricia, Harold Simmons, several other Cedar Ridge residents who'd finally found the courage to publicly acknowledge what their community had allowed to fester unchecked for over a decade under Debbie's carefully maintained authority and reputation. The judge entered, and the room fell silent, that particular silence heavy with nearly a year's accumulated tension finally reaching its resolution point. Debbie stood beside her attorney, posture rigid, staring straight ahead. Whatever remained of her composure stretched thin across a face that had visibly aged throughout these proceedings. "This court has reviewed extensive evidence," the judge began, documenting a sustained pattern of harassment, fraud, and financial theft spanning multiple years and multiple victims, executed by someone who held a position of trusted community authority and repeatedly abused that trust for personal vendetta and, ultimately, significant personal financial gain. The judge continued, addressing each charge individually: the restraining order violations, the fraudulent medical board complaint constituting felony filing of false documents, and the embezzlement charges totaling over $112,000 stolen from 3 separate community associations over multiple years of unchecked financial oversight. "The court finds particularly troubling," the judge said, pausing meaningfully, "the racial dimension underlying this pattern's origin, a targeted campaign that began, by the defendant's own documented statements and actions, from unfounded suspicion rooted in nothing more than Dr. Webb's race and the simple fact of his hard-earned success." Hearing that acknowledgement spoken formally, on the record, by a judge reviewing the full body of evidence, hit me harder than I expected. Months of feeling like I needed to prove, repeatedly, that what had happened to my family was real, was serious, finally received the institutional recognition it had always deserved. The judge sentenced Debbie to 7 years in state prison for the combined felony charges, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 4 years, along with mandatory full restitution of the embezzled funds and a permanent injunction barring her from serving in any HOA leadership capacity anywhere in the state. Debbie remained motionless as the sentence was read. No visible reaction beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. Whatever she'd expected walking into that courtroom, this clearly wasn't it. The woman who'd spent 11 years controlling every detail of Cedar Ridge Estates now faced years of losing control over her own life entirely. As bailiffs approached to escort her from the courtroom, she finally turned, briefly, meeting my eyes across the gallery for the first time since testimony began. I searched her expression for something: remorse, understanding, anything resembling genuine recognition of the harm she'd caused. I found only confusion, still unable to comprehend how she'd lost. I felt no triumph watching her led away in handcuffs, only a quiet, exhausted relief that this specific chapter had finally, definitively closed. Alicia's hand found mine. James exhaled slowly beside me, months of careful legal work finally reaching their conclusion. "Patricia," Behind us, wiped tears I understood came from complicated relief. Outside the courthouse, Christine approached for a brief statement. I kept it simple, I told her. It was about whether success and dignity get extended equally, regardless of who's driving down the street. Today, the justice system said they should. I'm grateful, but exhausted, that it took this long. The story made national news within days, picked up by outlets far beyond our local region. Drawn by the case's unusual combination of racial profiling, illegal search, felony fraud, and significant financial embezzlement, all traced back to one HOA president's decade of unchecked authority finally, thoroughly dismantled through documented evidence and patient legal process. Cedar Ridge Estates held an emergency community meeting the following week, implementing sweeping HOA reforms, mandatory financial audits, term limits for leadership positions, formal complaint review processes requiring board consensus rather than presidential discretion, and anti-discrimination training for all future board members moving forward into the community's next chapter. Harold Simmons was elected interim HOA president, his first official act formally apologizing to my family, on record, for the community's collective failure to intervene sooner despite mounting evidence throughout the ordeal. It wasn't full restitution for what we'd endured, but it represented genuine institutional accountability, something rare enough to matter. Patricia joined the newly reformed board as well, determined, she told me, to ensure Cedar Ridge never again allowed one person's unchecked prejudice to operate unchallenged for over a decade. We failed you, she said simply. Not just Debbie. Too long. I don't want that to happen again. 3 months after the sentencing, our neighborhood held its annual 4th of July block party, the first since everything had fully resolved. I drove the Lamborghini out that morning, top down, sunlight catching the paint I'd once hand-waxed while unaware it would become the center of such an extraordinary ordeal. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now stopped to genuinely admire the car, asking questions about the engine, the acceleration, the sound it made accelerating down our quiet street. The shift felt surreal, watching a community relearn how to simply appreciate something beautiful without suspicion clouding every interaction surrounding it. Zoe rode in the passenger seat for a short lap around the block, laughing freely in a way that reminded me exactly why I'd fought so hard to protect our family's peace throughout the entire ordeal. Some fights, I'd learned, weren't really about cars or HOA rules at all. They were about reclaiming safety. Alicia watched us from the driveway, camera raised, capturing the moment with visible relief evident across her face. We'd survived something that had tested every resource we possessed. Financial, emotional, legal, and personal. Watching our daughter laugh freely again felt like the truest measure of everything we'd fought so hard to protect. Patricia hosted a small gathering that evening, neighbors mingling comfortably in a way that hadn't felt possible for nearly a year. Harold gave a brief toast acknowledging the community's difficult journey, careful not to dwell too long on painful specifics, focusing instead on the reforms now protecting Cedar Ridge's future residents. I found myself, unexpectedly, feeling something like gratitude toward the ordeal itself, strange as that sounded even in my own head. It had cost us dearly, in sleep, in security, in Zoe's early sense of safety within her own neighborhood. But it had also revealed exactly who stood beside us when everything mattered most. James visited that weekend, no longer needed in a professional capacity but present simply as family. Watching Zoe splash in the community pool with genuine joy I hadn't seen from her in months. "You handled this better than most people could have," he told me quietly. Precise, patient, and it worked exactly like we hoped. I thought about Debbie sometimes, in the months that followed, not with anger anymore but something closer to weary reflection. She'd spent 11 years building an identity around control, around being the person who decided who belonged and who didn't. That identity, ultimately, proved as fragile as it was destructive to everyone around her. Roger reached out one final time before relocating to a different state entirely, thanking me, somewhat awkwardly, for handling everything the right way despite what his family had put mine through. I appreciated the gesture, wished him genuine peace moving forward, and let that particular chapter close quietly, without lingering resentment attached. Tyler completed his probation and community service requirements, and according to Patricia's last update, moved out of state as well, presumably seeking distance from a family legacy, now permanently associated with public scandal, embezzlement, and the kind of cautionary tale strangers referenced when discussing HOA overreach and unchecked institutional authority. Cedar Ridge Estates, meanwhile, slowly rebuilt its reputation, the reforms genuinely taking hold under Harold and Patricia's more transparent, accountable leadership. New families moved in over the following year, unaware of the neighborhood's recent history except through occasional mentions, the story gradually settling into local legend rather than active tension. I returned to my normal surgical schedule fully, the state medical board investigation having concluded definitively in my favor months earlier. My record not just cleared but strengthened by the public documentation of exactly how baseless the original fraudulent complaint against me had actually been from the very beginning. My hospital colleagues, many of whom had followed the local coverage closely, treated me with a quiet respect that felt different from before, less about my surgical skill, specifically, and more about having witnessed how I'd handled sustained injustice with patience, documentation, and unwavering composure throughout an incredibly difficult year. Zoe started third grade that fall at a new school we'd carefully chosen, closer to Alicia's work, offering a fresh start unburdened by any lingering neighborhood tension. She made friends quickly, her earlier anxiety gradually fading as normal childhood concerns, homework, friendships, favorite recess games, reclaimed their rightful place in her daily life. Alicia and I marked our 10th anniversary that October with a quiet dinner, reflecting on everything the past year had tested within our marriage and somehow, remarkably, strengthened rather than fractured. "We handled it as a team," she said, raising her glass. "Whatever comes next, I know we can handle that too." I drove the Lamborghini regularly now, without the constant awareness of being watched, photographed, or suspected that had shadowed nearly every drive during Debbie's campaign against us. Something about reclaiming that simple freedom, driving home without dread, felt like the truest personal victory buried within everything the legal system had formally resolved. Christine published a longer follow-up piece nearly a year after the sentencing, examining the broader implications of our case for HOA governance reform across the state, citing new legislation inspired partly by Cedar Ridge's scandal that required mandatory financial transparency and formal anti-discrimination protections for all homeowners associations statewide. I was invited to speak briefly at a legislative hearing supporting that new legislation, sharing our family's experience not for sympathy but to illustrate concretely why formal protections mattered, why unchecked authority within seemingly minor community institutions could inflict genuinely serious harm without proper oversight and accountability structures in place. The legislation passed with strong bipartisan support months later. And while I understood our case was just one contributing factor among many similar stories from families across the state, knowing our ordeal had contributed to meaningful structural change offered a form of resolution that transcended Debbie's individual sentencing alone. Patricia called occasionally to update me on Cedar Ridge's continued reforms, describing a community genuinely transformed from the fear-based, control-driven atmosphere Debbie had cultivated for over a decade. "It actually feels like a neighborhood now," she told me once, "instead of a kingdom with one very insecure queen running everything." I laughed at that description, appreciating how thoroughly the community had processed and moved beyond what could easily have remained a permanently toxic legacy. Sometimes genuine crisis, however painful in the moment, created space for authentic transformation that gradual, comfortable complacency never would have allowed to happen organically otherwise. 2 years after the sentencing, I received word through the prison's public record system that Debbie had been denied parole at her first eligible hearing, the board citing continued lack of accountability during incarceration, including several documented incidents of conflict with fellow inmates over perceived slights to her authority. Some part of me felt genuine sadness reading that update, imagining a woman apparently unable to change even facing years of consequences for choices that had destroyed her marriage, estranged her son, ended her community standing, and cost her freedom entirely. Prison, seemed, hadn't taught her anything new about herself. James, when I mentioned this to him, offered a perspective that stuck with me. "Some people spend their whole lives building an identity so rigid it can't bend without shattering completely," he said. Debbie's identity was built entirely on control and being right. Losing that isn't something everyone knows how to survive. I thought about that conversation often over the following months, recognizing something almost tragic underneath the entire ordeal, separate from the very real harm Debbie had inflicted on my family. She'd never learned, apparently, that genuine security comes from within, not from controlling everyone and everything around you into submission. Our lives, meanwhile, continued moving steadily forward. Zoe turned 9, thriving in her new school, occasionally mentioning the old neighborhood with the casual distance of a child who'd processed difficult events without lasting damage. Exactly what Alicia and I had worked so hard throughout the ordeal to protect and preserve for her. I was promoted to head of orthopedic surgery at my hospital that spring, a role I'd worked toward for years, finally achieved without the shadow of fraudulent accusations hanging over my professional reputation. The promotion felt sweeter, somehow, having survived someone's deliberate attempt to destroy exactly this kind of career milestone entirely. Alicia started her own small business that same year, an interior design consultancy she dreamed about for years, but delayed pursuing during the chaos of Debbie's campaign against us. Watching her build something entirely her own, unburdened by fear or distraction, reminded me exactly how much we'd both reclaimed since that difficult year. We hosted a small dinner party that summer, our first in the new house, inviting Patricia, Harold, James, and a few close friends who'd supported us throughout everything. Sitting around that table, laughter filling a space finally, fully our own. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for years. Patricia raised a toast that evening, unprompted, thanking Alicia and me for teaching her, and honestly the entire Cedar Ridge community, what genuine courage looked like in the face of sustained injustice. "You never lost yourselves in it," she said.
You just kept documenting the truth.
I thought about that toast often afterward, recognizing it as perhaps the truest summary of everything we'd endured and ultimately overcome. We hadn't fought fire with fire, hadn't matched Debbie's chaos with chaos of our own. We'd simply, patiently, persistently documented reality until reality became impossible for anyone to ignore any longer. 3 years after the sentencing, Debbie's second parole hearing was denied as well, extending her minimum sentence closer to the full 7 years originally imposed. I learned this through Patricia rather than seeking the information myself, having largely moved past active interest in tracking her ongoing incarceration and its various developments. Our lives had genuinely, fully moved beyond Cedar Ridge Estates by that point. New careers flourishing, Zoe approaching middle school with the confidence of a child who'd never let fear define her. Our marriage strengthened rather than fractured by everything we'd navigated together during that exceptionally difficult year of our lives. I still owned the Lamborghini, still drove it regularly, though it had transformed in meaning somewhere along the way, from a simple symbol of hard-earned success into something closer to a reminder of resilience, of refusing to let someone else's prejudice dictate what I deserved to enjoy in my own life. Sometimes, driving home from the hospital after a long surgical shift, I think back to that first day Debbie stood at her lawn's edge, arms crossed, studying the car like it had personally offended her. I understood now, fully, that her offense had never really been about the vehicle at all. It had been about a black man succeeding beyond what her worldview could comfortably accommodate. About status and authority she'd built her entire identity around suddenly feeling threatened by simple, undeniable evidence that success didn't belong exclusively to people who looked like her or shared her particular narrow assumptions about deserving it. That understanding no longer carried the sharp sting it once had. Time, distance, and genuine justice had transformed it into something closer to clarity. A lesson learned the hard way but thoroughly absorbed nonetheless. About the particular kind of courage required to simply exist, successfully and unapologetically, in spaces designed to make you feel unwelcome. Alicia and I eventually decided, for years after everything concluded, to write about our experience more publicly, contributing to a broader conversation about racial profiling within residential communities, working alongside civil rights organizations advocating for stronger protections against exactly the kind of sustained harassment our family had endured. Zoe, older now, occasionally asked thoughtful questions about that period, processing it with increasing maturity as she grew. "Are you scared it could happen again?" she asked once, genuinely curious rather than anxious. "No," I told her honestly, "because now I know exactly how to fight it, and exactly why it's worth fighting." That conversation stayed with me, a reminder that the ordeal, however painful, had ultimately taught our entire family something valuable about resilience, about documentation, about refusing to let someone else's unfounded prejudice determine our sense of safety or belonging anywhere we genuinely earned the right to call home. I think about Cedar Ridge Estates sometimes still, Not with lingering anger, but with a kind of settled understanding about everything that transpired there. A community that failed us initially, then ultimately found the courage to acknowledge that failure and implement genuine reforms, preventing similar harm to future residents moving forward. Patricia remained on the reformed HOA board for years afterward, occasionally sending updates about new families, about the mandatory transparency measures still functioning exactly as intended, about a neighborhood that had genuinely transformed from Debbie's decade of controlled fear into something closer to authentic community built on actual trust. Harold eventually stepped down as president, replaced by a younger resident committed to maintaining the reforms both he and Patricia had fought hard to establish. Cedar Ridge Estates, whatever its complicated history, had ultimately become a case study in genuine institutional accountability rather than remaining a cautionary tale of unchecked prejudice forever. 5 years after the sentencing, I received an unexpected letter, forwarded through my attorney's office, from Debbie herself, apparently written during a mandated therapy program she'd finally engaged with seriously during her final year of incarceration before her eventual release date approached on the horizon ahead. The letter was brief, awkward, clearly the product of genuine internal struggle rather than practiced performance. She acknowledged, for the first time in any documented capacity, that her actions had been driven by fear and prejudice I refused to examine honestly for most of my life until I lost everything. She didn't ask for forgiveness explicitly, seemed to understand that wasn't hers to request or expect. She simply wanted, she wrote, to acknowledge directly the harm she'd caused my family, something the legal proceedings had established factually, but that she'd never previously admitted in her own words. To me, without qualification or deflection. I sat with that letter for a long time, uncertain exactly how to feel. Alicia, reading it beside me, said simply, "It doesn't undo anything. But it's more than most people like her ever managed to offer." I found myself agreeing, recognizing genuine, if belated, accountability when I finally encountered it directly. I didn't respond to the letter, not out of continued anger, but because I genuinely didn't know what response could add anything meaningful to a situation already thoroughly resolved through years of legal process, community reform, and our family's own hard-won healing. Some closures, I'd learned, didn't require reciprocal correspondence. Debbie was released on parole shortly after serving her extended minimum sentence, relocating, according to Patricia's final update on the matter, to a small town several states away, apparently working toward rebuilding some quiet version of life far removed from the community whose trust she'd so thoroughly violated. I never heard from her again after that single letter, and I found I genuinely didn't need to. Our family had built something solid and lasting from the wreckage of that difficult year, a resilience I hoped, eventually, Zoe would carry forward as her own lesson about facing injustice with patience, documentation, and unwavering integrity. Looking back now, years removed from that first fruit basket disguising suspicion, I understand the entire ordeal taught me something I try to pass along whenever I share our story publicly. Dignity, once genuinely earned, cannot actually be taken by someone else's prejudice, no matter how relentlessly or creatively they try. Can be challenged, certainly. Can cost you sleep, security, and considerable emotional toll along the way. But it cannot be permanently erased by someone determined to see you as less than you actually are, provided you're willing to document, to persist, and to trust that truth eventually finds its way forward. I think about my mother sometimes, the woman who worked double shifts folding hospital laundry so I could eventually stand in operating rooms saving lives instead. I think about the promise I made her, that I'd own something nobody could take from me. I understand now that promise was never really about the car. It was about the life I'd built, the family I'd protected, the career I'd earned through years of genuine sacrifice and skill. Debbie tried, relentlessly, to take that from me anyway, through fabricated violations, illegal searches, fraudulent complaints, and sustained harassment. She failed, ultimately, because what I'd built was never truly hers to take. Cedar Ridge Estates continues on today, a genuinely reformed community by every account I still receive through Patricia's occasional updates, its history now serving as a cautionary example rather than an ongoing pattern of harm. New families move in regularly, unaware of the specific ordeal but benefiting directly from its resulting reforms. My daughter Zoe, now approaching her teenage years, sometimes tells the story herself when relevant conversations arise among her friends, framing it not as trauma but as evidence that persistence and documentation can overcome even deeply entrenched prejudice, provided you're patient enough and fortunate enough to see genuine justice through completely. I remain grateful, even now, for everyone who stood beside us throughout that difficult year. Patricia, whose courage eventually overcame years of quiet complicity. James, whose meticulous legal work built an undeniable case. Harold, whose late but genuine accountability helped reform an entire community's approach to unchecked institutional authority. Most of all, I remain grateful for Alicia, whose steady partnership throughout the entire ordeal reminded me constantly why the fight mattered, and for Zoe, whose resilience through genuine fear taught me more about courage than I'd learned across 14 years of medical training combined, in ways I still carry forward daily. The Lamborghini still sits in our driveway today, no longer a target for suspicion but simply a car, appreciated for exactly what it represents: hard-earned success, patiently protected against relentless prejudice, ultimately vindicated through documentation, community reform, and a justice system that, however slowly, eventually recognized the truth clearly. I drive it most weekends now, sometimes with Zoe beside me, sometimes alone, always aware of exactly how much that simple freedom costs to reclaim. Some drives carry more weight than others realize. Weight built from months of fabricated violations, illegal searches, and sustained harassment finally, fully, permanently overcome through patient persistence. Whenever I share our story now, at legislative hearings, community forums, or simply conversations with strangers who recognize the case from Christine's original reporting years earlier, I emphasize one consistent lesson: document everything, trust the process even when it moves frustratingly slowly, and never let someone else's prejudice define your own worth. That lesson, hard-won through nearly a year of sustained injustice, remains the truest legacy of everything Cedar Ridge Estates put our family through. Debbie Ashworth tried to convince an entire community that I didn't belong. Instead, she taught all of us exactly what genuine belonging, patiently defended, actually looks like. I received one final piece of news about Debbie 2 years after her release, learning through a brief mention in Christine's continued investigative work that she'd attempted, unsuccessfully, to join another homeowners association board in her new town, only to be rejected immediately once her documented history became known to that community. Some patterns, apparently, follow people regardless of distance or fresh starts, particularly when those patterns involve documented felony convictions for fraud and embezzlement. Stemming from abused positions of community trust and authority exercised without any meaningful accountability for over a decade of unchecked, relentless institutional control. I felt, reading that final update, a quiet sense of appropriate closure rather than lingering satisfaction. Debbie's story had reached its natural conclusion, consequences following her choices exactly as they should, while our family's story had continued moving forward, building new chapters entirely separate from the shadow she'd once cast over everything. Cedar Ridge Estates held its annual community celebration again this past summer, and Patricia sent photos, unprompted, of neighbors gathering comfortably, children playing freely, an atmosphere of genuine warmth replacing the controlled tension that had once defined the neighborhood under Debbie's relentless, prejudiced leadership for over a decade. I looked at those photos for a long time, recognizing faces I remembered from that difficult year, now smiling freely in a community genuinely transformed. Whatever harm Debbie had inflicted, whatever fear she'd cultivated through years of unchecked authority, the neighborhood had ultimately proven more resilient than her prejudice, rebuilding into something authentically better. Alicia and I talk sometimes about whether we'd have handled everything differently, knowing now how it all eventually resolved. We always arrive at the same conclusion: patience, documentation, and unwavering integrity, however exhausting in the moment, remained the only path toward genuine, lasting justice rather than temporary, unsatisfying compromise. Zoe, watching us have that conversation recently, offered her own characteristically direct observation. "You didn't need to be perfect," she said. "You just needed to keep telling the truth until people finally listened." I felt something warm settle in my chest, hearing my own hard-won lesson reflected back through my daughter's clarity. That, ultimately, remains the truest summary of everything we endured and overcame. We didn't need to match Debbie's chaos, her fabrications, her relentless prejudice with anything beyond consistent, documented, patient truth. Eventually, that truth proved more powerful than any lie she'd constructed across nearly a year of sustained harassment against us. I think about that first day often now. Debbie standing at her lawn's edge, studying my new Lamborghini like it had personally offended her simply by existing in our shared driveway. I understand now, fully and completely, that her offense was never really about the car parked there. It was about who was driving it. A black man, successful, confident, and utterly unwilling to accept that someone else's prejudice determined what he deserved to enjoy in the life he genuinely earned through years of sacrifice, skill, and unwavering determination. That truth, ultimately, proved impossible for Debbie's constructed narrative to overcome, no matter how relentlessly she tried. The community I once feared losing entirely has become, through genuine reform and collective accountability, a place I'm honestly proud to have once called home. Its difficult history, now serving as proof that even deeply entrenched prejudice can be overcome through patience, documentation, and a community's eventual willingness to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Patricia still calls occasionally, updating me on new families, new reforms, new evidence that Cedar Ridge Estates has genuinely transformed from what it once was under Debbie's decade of controlled authority. Each call feels like confirmation that our difficult year ultimately produced change extending far beyond our own family's individual healing. James remains a close friend today. Our relationship forged through crisis but sustained through genuine mutual respect built during those difficult months of careful documentation and patient legal strategy. He still occasionally references our case in his own work, citing it as an example of methodical persistence overcoming sustained institutional prejudice. Alicia's design business continues thriving. Zoe continues growing into exactly the confident, clear-eyed young woman we always hoped she'd become, and I continue practicing medicine, now as department head, in a career that survived a deliberate, fraudulent attempt at destruction and emerged, ultimately, stronger and more secure than before. Our family's story, difficult as it was to live through, ultimately became proof of something I try to remind myself of regularly. Prejudice, however relentless, however creatively disguised as concern or authority, cannot permanently overcome patient, documented truth, provided you're willing to see the fight through completely, no matter how long it takes. The Lamborghini still gleams in our driveway most mornings. No longer a target for suspicion, simply a reminder of everything we survived and everything we ultimately reclaimed. Debbie Ashworth searched that car illegally once, convinced she'd find something incriminating. What she found instead, eventually, was the end of everything she'd built. 5 minutes after the truth finally surfaced completely, in that packed courtroom nearly a year after it all began, she lost her position, her freedom, her family, and the illusion of control she'd spent 11 years constructing. Justice, however delayed, arrived exactly where it belonged, for everyone who'd waited patiently to see it.